Morning, people. It's Marc on the 17th, no, sorry, the 11th. I'm a bit ahead of myself, of April 2017. That's what I was going to say. Want to discuss in about half an hour today the third unit, is that correct? No, the fourth unit in the Counselling Diploma. It's actually Learning Guide 10, strangely enough. It's CHCCSL003. That's the old 503B for people that are still familiar with the old diploma, facilitating the counselling relationship and process. Now, this unit has a fair bit of material in there, so I'll go through it fairly quick again today just to give you a general overview. There's too much to discuss in just half an hour. What I want to focus on today a little bit more is Section 1, supporting the clients to identify and work through concerns, and Section 3, bringing the counselling relationship to an end. There is Section 2 as well, monitoring the counselling process and ensuring effective counselling, but I'll leave that one today. We'll probably do a separate workshop on that, because evaluation, monitoring, etc. is worth a workshop on its own. So we'll race through that a little bit, and we'll stop, look and listen to Section 1 and Section 3 a little bit more. Right, Section 1, supporting clients to identify and work through concerns. As with the previous workshops, I'll just keep scrolling and highlight a couple of things that I know from my experience as a counsellor and as a tutor are important for you guys to know and understand. Obviously, always keep in the back of your mind and read the readings in the back for additional material. And what I want you to also realize is that this unit, when I prepped it, it made me feel like there is too much in there for the beginner's mind to understand, if that makes sense. There's so much information in there, which is awesome, but for beginning counselors or counseling students, it could be very overwhelming, because what this unit tries to do is give you an overview of what you would do in a counseling session, and pretty much stuff everything in there that you will discuss in the 17 units that the counseling course is rich. That therefore looks like it's Campbell's soup. All the ingredients are in there, but it's crammed in a condensed version, and especially if you're a beginner, it will look very overwhelming. So don't get too overwhelmed by it. I'll highlight the things that I find important, and we'll go from there. Okay, preparing for the counseling relationship. That's an easy one. As long as you make sure that your room is in order, and as long as you got things ready, like a contract, a payment schedule, termination procedures, the amount of sessions that people get, then you're ready to rock and roll. Now, you don't have to have that all on paper, but you do want to have your room set up, and definitely make sure that you are prepared for the session. I have made the mistake, as we all will at some stage, to rush home or be home already, but have to rush through a previous session, and then the next one's already sitting there, and you don't have a chance to actually look at the case, and you just go by feel based on the conversation you might have had 2 weeks ago with that person about coming in, and you go like, I hope I remember everything. That's not a good way to go into the first session, because you feel slightly stressed already. So when you know what sessions you have that day, do some prepping, either just before the session, or read the case notes of all the sessions that you know are planned that day. And if it's a new one, see if you can find some information on that client based on an initial call or an email that you've had from her or him. So you know what you're talking about, and you know who you're talking with. So the first bit of the helping relationship is always helping the client tell their stories. Obviously, that's what it's all about. So I'll go through all that. Right, now here's where it gets interesting. You want to have a look at, and I hope you still have that book or get it yourself, either from the college or buy it. It's Geldart and Geldart. I think it's called Basic Personal Counseling or something. It's one of those Bibles. The book reference is in the back of this unit, and it's the same type of Bible as Ivy and Ivy. The Ivy and Ivy book. I think they will be mentioned. So let me have a quick look at the back for you. Oh, this will make your eyes go all funny. Let's have a look-see. Ivy and Ivy don't get mentioned, but this is Geldart and Geldart. Definitely get that one. It's one of those intro books that you want to read and have and use as a resource material later on. All right, supporting the client in telling their story. Here we go. Now, the first time a client comes in, when you look at the structure of a session, obviously, if they haven't been in before, but they have had contact with you, you want to make sure they understand what's going to happen, and that's called structuring. Now, if you have spoken to the client before, maybe on phone or over the email or whichever way, maybe have some paperwork ready that you can email to them. Like in my private practice, what I do, and I might have told you that last unit discussion, I have a blank, bland contract that I just send people for them to peruse. It's a one-pager, a small font. All the necessary information I think is in there. And I also send them my code of conduct, which is a piece of paper about 2 pages long, where I have collated over the years from other websites and from other counsellors what I think is important that people can expect from me, like high quality service, the right to complain, the right to pick me up on errors, etc., whatever. It's about 2 pages. If I have spoken to the client before as an intro call or an intro chat even, because I do 45-minute quick intro chats to get an idea what's going on, then I'll send them that before the session. That's the contract and my code of conduct, so they know what's going on, and I don't have to spend too much time on that one at the first session, because I want to spend time talking to the client about their problems, not about my confidentiality agreement and all that sort of stuff. I've seen students do that in pracs where the confidentiality, the structuring, the referral processes, etc., take about 15 minutes. Well, in my personal view, as a practitioner, that's 15 minutes wasted. That could have been 15 minutes spent on the client telling their story and already making a start on helping them resolve that story. So if I can do my structuring quick, I'll do it quick. So my confidentiality spiel, which I will repeat at the first session, is about 1.5 minutes, and that's it. And it goes somewhere like this. Nice to meet you. Just before we get started, let me run you through a couple of pieces of housekeeping. First of all, everything we talk about today is confidential. That means that everything we talk about stays between these 4 walls. There's a couple of exceptions to that. When I suspect that there's a risk of suicide, risk of you harming yourself or someone else, or I suspect some criminal activities going on, I will have to break confidentiality, and I will contact whomever I deem the most important person to contact at that stage. I will also take notes. Those notes fall under the confidentiality as well, so they stay under lock and key. No one gets to see them. There's an exception to that one as well. If the courts ever subpoena me to hand over my notes, I will have to, and with your consent, I might also hand them over to my supervisor or colleagues if that is the case, or if that's necessary, but that'll only happen with your consent. Does that make sense? That's pretty much my confidentiality spiel. Then the structuring spiel in terms of session goes something like, okay, today's session will last for about 60 minutes. We will talk for about 45 to 50 minutes, and about 10 minutes we'll spend on wrapping up and coming up with some action steps for between now and next session. And our series will be, well, that depends obviously on what you got, but we will have about 8 or 10 sessions, each of about 60 minutes each. Does that make sense? Any questions? No? Good. Let's get going. What brought you here? That's my introduction, and that's what I do, and that's the easiest one. The rest is all in the paperwork I send them. Now, okay, back to Geldart and Geldart. The biggest skill that you'll ever learn as a counselor is listening. It's professional listening and it's professional responding, but professional listening first and foremost is one of the most important skills that you will learn as a counselor. Now read up on that one in Geldart and Ivy and Ivy. Good listening is listening with interest, like using minimal responses, invitations to continue, non-verbal behavior, your body language has to be correct, and using silence is to get the client's story out. And I'll let all this go. Okay. When you look at the problem of the client, generally, you want to go from general to specific, and that's what they talk about here as well. When a client comes in and your first question after your confidentiality spiel and structuring is, okay, what brought you here today? Or what can I do for you? Or why did you decide and come to see me? Then generally they'll start talking generic. It's like, I'm feeling a bit depressed, or I'm having issues with my partner, or I'm suffering from anxiety. Now, they will generally talk more generic in the beginning, and it is your job as a counselor to get them to be more specific. In order to do that, you can ask questions about the history of the problem, thoughts and feelings relating to the problem, the morale and expectations around the problem, and the client's level of agency with which they call their motivation to change, and their investment of time and money. What would they do? So read those questions and start start using them to help the client get their story out. Now, remember from one of the previous workshops, I think it was 001 or training sessions, you look at the 5-stage or the 3-stage problem solving, or what we call it, counseling process. So if you look at Ivy and Ivy, they talk about the 5-stage process, where we first let the client do their story, bring out the concerns, bring out the problems. Then we look at some problem solving stuff, and restorying is like, okay, what's the new story going to be? And ultimately you look for action steps. This all falls under that 5-step or 3-step process, and I'll talk about the 3 steps a little bit later because it gets a mention in here. One of the other things that you'll find is that clients often have a problem prioritizing their concerns. They'll come in to you with maybe a raft of problems, and for them all those problems have equal weight. So they're all hard, they're all difficult, and it's for them it's nearly impossible to do something about it. So your job is to actually help them prioritize, and you can do that by using the tools and the guidelines that are here on page 17 of your learner guide. So have a read through that, because once the client is telling their story, ultimately you want to get to a point where you can say, okay, which one would you like to work on first? Out of all the problems that we've discussed, which one is the most pressing? Which one is the one that influences you most? Or which problem is the one that, once resolved, would bring you the greatest amount of relief? That's the one you want to start working on, and that's a question you want to start asking them as well, which will be in the guiding questions too. Now, a little note that they make here on issues and concerns requiring immediate attention and action. Obviously, when a client presents with either suicide ideation, risk of harm to either self or others, or any criminal behavior, you need to do something straight away. That is a topic that we'll discuss further in units on clients at risk, but keep in mind that that could happen. Sometimes you will get clients in that will need some immediate help. I know from my experience when I was doing counseling in employment services, I had a client coming in the morning, and she just freshly self-harmed herself by cutting her forearms with a razor blade. So she came in not necessarily dripping, but there was definitely signs of her having cut herself, to the point her arms were still covered in little blood smudges and stuff, and the cuts were fairly fresh. Now, what do you do? Well, in my case, we went over to the chemist. I actually took her to the chemist next door, or actually first to the GP next door, GP surgery with a chemist. Made sure she got immediate attention so they could clean her up, literally just clean up her arms, put a bit of Dettol on it or whatever, just disinfect it, put some bandage around it, and make sure that she was okay. And after that, we actually had our session. So it was all right, but that stuff needs immediate attention first. Now, that was a relatively innocent one, but you might come in contact with a client who is seriously suicidal, or is seriously intending harm, or is seriously suffering from a mental illness or a psychosis, and then you'll need to be able to do something about it. As said previously, don't worry about that too much yet. There will be units on how to do that, but keep in mind that that might be part of your job. Referrals, you can read all through that yourself, and counseling plans, same thing. Ultimately, what you do with a client will hopefully turn out into a counseling plan. What are we going to do? Now, don't get caught up in that having to be a written plan. As long as you make notes, and as long as the client understands what's going on and needs to happen, your counseling plans can be verbal. There's no need to have all your counseling plans written out. Same with contracts. Your counseling contract that you use for your practice, yes, preferably written out, but the contract that you make with a client to make them do stuff or have them do homework, they don't need to be necessarily written and signed. You can do that as a sort of ceremonial process, but there's no need. As long as you and the client are clear on what needs to be doing in the plan and in the individual contract, that is good. And then you've got all your stuff that you need. Right, supporting clients to experience their emotions and process their difficulties. Clients will come in with all sorts of feelings, and sometimes those feelings are pretty solid, pretty there, let's call it that way. And you want to help a client deal with that. Read through this. It'll definitely show in their non-verbal behavior. They generally come in looking depressed or looking sad or angry. You can often just spot it by their words, by their behavior. Sometimes there's a discrepancy in there. They might come in and you can see that there's something going on that's pretty deep. You say, look, how have you been? And they say, oh yeah, all right. Well, that's a blatant lie, obviously, because otherwise they wouldn't be sitting there. But they might not want to talk about that yet. In that case, it's your job to recognize the emotion and perhaps do something with it, during the session. Reflection of feeling, big one. Geldart and Geldart, Ivy and Ivy go deep into that one. It's the Carl Rogers person-centered therapy style of helping a client. So reflect feelings, reflect emotions. Have a read through that one. Very important to know all that. So make some effort in learning all that stuff. How do you help a client to explore and elaborate on their stories and concerns? Well, a good way of doing that is actually helping the client understand how they have done well. So slow them down, take your time, or make them feel comfortable. Let's put it that way. So how they've done well and how you can make them feel comfortable. A couple of ways to do that are mentioned here. Good way of helping a client out. Okay, that's all for you to read. That's a case scenario. Right, this one I want to discuss a little bit. Parallels and links in the client's concerns. Often a client will share a story and you can pretty much feel, especially if you've been in counseling for a while, that this is a repetition of a previous story, or it seems to be a pattern in their lives or a theme that was just coming up. I had a client last week who came in, and I can't go too deep into the story, was for anonymity reasons, but the whole problem was that she was doing something right now that allowed her to disconnect her thoughts from her feelings. So she was in a situation where her feelings were actually so strong and making her feel so bad that the only way that she felt she could deal with that was to just push them away with thought and just think around them, rationalize them away. And that was in relation to a relationship, and where she did that, and that was her main issue, where she had found a new friend, a new guy in her life, and she really didn't want to acknowledge the fact that she was feeling more for him than she was. Or she actually was feeling a lot for him, but she didn't want to acknowledge that. So she was trying to reason that away, in order not to be hurt. And it turned out that she was applying that same technique in her work, where she had a bullying boss. So her boss was bullying her, actually still is, I think. And the only way that she could deal with her feelings of, feeling inadequate and feeling unappreciated was to rationalize that away. Now, those are things you'll come across in clients quite often. So the issue that they present with often will link back, or will often have a parallel somewhere else where they are. It's either a theme in their life that seems to be coming back, relationship issues or employment issues, or it's around a pattern of dealing with those issues where they keep doing the same thing, and obviously not effectively, because otherwise they wouldn't have a problem, but it seems to be coming back. In this case, when this client of mine found out that she was doing the same thing in her potentially new relationship with this guy as she was with her employer in her work, she had an epiphany. And it was only the first session. Now, we're not there yet. There's still more work to be done. for her to realize that that was a defense mechanism, trying to rationalize her feelings away. And her claim was that she couldn't get in contact with her feelings. Well, no, I bet you can't if that's what you do. Yeah, so use that sort of stuff. Use the patterns or themes, patterns or themes in the client's life to help identify what's going on and see maybe how people are using that for the right reasons, but not in an effective way. Sharing hunches. You'll find in counseling that a lot of theorists and academics will tell you that you can't give any advice, or you're not supposed to put your own opinion in counseling. Well, I've got my own idea on that one. But with sharing hunches, I think everyone agrees that sometimes it's okay to express what you think is going on, in a sense, or give a stab, or take a stab at what you feel is going on. And you can do that quite gently by saying, look, is there a chance that maybe you are using the same coping technique in your new relationship as you are in your work? And that's a question that a client will consider, obviously. Now, you could fall flat on your face as a counselor because your client might bluntly say, no, that's not the case, and that's okay. But at least you've shared that hunch and you've opened up for a discussion. So be ready to be rejected in that sense. They might just completely disagree with you, but at least it gives you a topic for discussion. Use that one. It's pretty effective and handy. Now, implementing interventions, that goes too deep. I won't discuss that in detail. Okay, what technique are you going to use on that client once they've got their story out? Well, that's something that will come across more clearly in units or like 006, which is more on the counseling interventions. So I'll leave you to reading this. There are some of those ones, and I'll mention those, where it seems logical to not use a certain technique on a certain problem. I had a student the other day that was doing their practicals for counseling interventions, and he was considering using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is all about trying to have a different perspective on things, or changing the way you think and behave on an issue of domestic violence. In this case, it was then the person was subjected to domestic violence, and he wanted to use CBT on that. That's not necessarily the first right choice. You could, but domestic violence is very much a behavioral thing that happens to you. And to work with a client on changing their perspective around that might not be the right solution. I'm not saying it's not, but it might not be. So that wouldn't be an automatic initial hunch for me to say, yep, let's use CBT on domestic violence. And there'll be a couple other ones. So we'll talk about that later. Client strengths, very important. When you look at Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy and even solution-focused therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, it's very important to help the client see that they already have the resources to solve their own problem, or that they already have done well in a previous case, or where they show great resolve and actually being able to do certain things. So praise them and acknowledge them for that. And here are a couple of ways that Geldart and Geldart mentioned that you can do that. To have a read through that one, it's page 29. Okay, righto, here we go. So when you look at that 3-step process or the 5-step process, I don't really care which one you pick. But definitely there is stages to the counseling process and to each counseling session. Now, once you keep that in mind, sessions actually flow quite well. I've had the same thing in Toastmasters, which is a public speaking organization. The simple way Toastmasters always taught us to speak is like, first you're going to talk what you're going to talk about, and then you're actually going to talk about it. And in the end, you're going to talk about what you just talked about, if that makes sense. So, when you set up a speech, you're first going to tell people what you'll be telling them. Then you actually tell them, and as a conclusion, you tell them what you just told them. And that's the same sort of process with counseling. Stage 1 in the counseling process is establishing a relationship and agreeing how to work together. The middle stage in this 3-step process is working with the client on their issues towards change, and ultimately they'll be working towards an ending. Now, that is for the whole counseling series, but it's also for each counseling session. There's a beginning, a middle bit, and an ending. So the beginning in a continuing counseling journey could be something like, okay, how have you been, since we spoke last? What's happened? And what would you like to talk about today? Then stage 2 would obviously be, what the client would like to talk about today and how to work through that. And stage 3 would be, right, now that we've talked about what we wanted to talk about today, what are you going to do next? And bring the session to an end. If you stick to that beginning, middle bit, ending, and keep an eye on the time, because as a counselor you are the timekeeper, then your sessions will generally all go right. Now, as said, I'm going to stroll through this one. Monitoring the counselling process, ensuring effective counselling. Just read through that one at your own leisure. We'll get to discuss that later on. I'm just going to skip through that pretty quick. There we go. Scroll, scroll, scroll. Rightio. Last bit, bringing a counselling relationship to an end. Now, every counselling relationship will ultimately come to an end. It sounds like, yeah, duh, but not everyone realizes that. There are many reasons why counselling comes to an end. The required amount of sessions is done. You might get funding for 5 sessions, and after 5 sessions, that's it. The client might obviously get a solution to the problem they came in with, and that's fine too. That will bring the counselling to an end as well. It could be the amount of time that's passed that might bring the counselling relationship to an end. But there could also be things as simple as the client moves out of the region and can't, and wants to come in face to face, and that's not possible anymore. Well, that would bring the counselling relationship to an end. Or the client has a more serious issue than you can deal with and needs a referral, which will bring the counselling relationship to an end. Or there is some counter-transference going on, where you might actually get some feelings for the client, or vice versa, which from a duty of care point of view would bring the counselling to an end. Or there's some other conflict of interest. So there's plenty of reasons why and when counselling should end. So keep an eye on that one when you look at it, because pretty much, from the word go, you are looking at ending the counselling relationship at some stage. The whole idea is to make yourself redundant, as I always have said from my very early years. My aim with my counselling is to make sure that I'm not needed anymore, that people can do without my help. So my aim is to bring them to that point where they can do their own thing and don't need me anymore. So you start really with the end in mind already. Now, if that's not possible for whatever reason, so if clients get quite far, but have the majority of their problems solved, but still need more help, then up to you it is to actually help them, get further support. So you discuss that. You might do some more sessions later on. You can refer them on. You give them some feedback, you give them some information on other support agencies out there, but don't just leave them hanging. When a client is, for whatever reason, when the counselling relationship ends, you want to make sure you put some added value on top of that by making sure that they know they can always come back. And if they don't want to come back to you, always leave on a good note by giving them some extra information that they can take home. And okay, that's about it. I think that is actually it. The readings after that. Now, there's obviously with ending a counselling relationship, there's a couple of processes that are involved. So it's either ending one session, that's just when time's up. Ending a series of sessions, that's when the series is up. But you also want to be careful about not doing it too abruptly or too briskly. So make sure the client understands that we're only 2 sessions away from the end. And also with individual sessions, make sure the client understands that we're 45 minutes into it, so we'll be closing off soon. And there's plenty more on that one that we'll discuss in more detail when I do training sessions on ending the series or ending the session, because it's all about that structuring. You're in control, it's your session. Obviously, it deals with the client, but you're in charge of how the session actually runs, even though the client is in charge of the content of the session, but the structure is yours, and you've got to keep that in mind. Okay, that's all you're going to get today. I really want to keep it to half an hour, these quick training ones. So 003 all around helping the client work through their process or through their concerns and the counselling process. Read all the readings in the back, please. There's plenty of good stuff in there, and really only learn counselling by getting as much information in there. Now, if you want to do some practicals, or if you want to do a role play or any other practical skills on how to open or close sessions, we can do that. Let me know by Facebook or whichever way. But keep reading your stuff and keep practicing, because ultimately practice makes perfect, and that's one of the many reasons why the government has put so many more practicals in the current counselling diploma than they did in the old one. Not having any placement in the diploma level counselling makes it really hard to get started unless you've got some practical experience, and this unit sort of gives you a big overview of what you would do in a counselling session or in counselling series. So have a good read. Let me know if you've got any questions, and if not, then I'll call it a day and speak to you next time. All right, enjoy.